This story begins with a bank heist in a building surrounded by the police. Inside the building, we would see the robbers wearing clown masks, threatening the police with killing the hostages if they did anything. Meanwhile, the police officers down below would wonder where the heroes were, complaining about them. After all that, one of the police officers would tell the other to look behind him, only to realize that an individual named Jade, wearing a suit, was standing right there, who apparently, according to the police officer's words, was a hero. Jade would tell them they didn't have to act surprised and that he had heard everything they said. He also told them they could leave, that he would take care of it. Sparks of electricity would start to come out of his body, and suddenly, Jade would disappear and reappear in front of the criminal who was holding a hostage. The criminal would be frightened to see the hero suddenly appear in front of him and would threaten him, saying that if he took another step, he would kill the hostage. Then, Jade would proceed to kill the hostage himself so that the criminal no longer had that hostage, and the criminal would be surprised to see that he now only had a corpse in his hands. The hero, on the other hand, would smile while saying that he couldn't believe they did that to the hostage, which would scare the robber, who would respond by pointing his gun at Jade. But then, half of the criminal's face would disappear as he received a blow from the hero, who would grab one of the robbers standing behind him, threatening the hostages, and use his body to start shooting the other hostages, and then slit the criminal's throat. With all that done, there would be no more hostages to worry about, and the hero would begin a brutal massacre against these criminals. All of this would be observed by a girl who was watching from a distance of several buildings, wearing a red jacket and silver hair. The girl was accompanied by a man with silver hair, who was disabled and sitting in a wooden wheelchair. Both of them were talking about the hero Jade, and the man would say that with Jade's death, his training would be complete. The girl would respond that she didn't need his help and that she hadn't needed it until that moment. Then, the girl would jump off the building they were standing on. At that moment, the story of this world would be narrated, about how the heroes followed a rule. If they had to choose between saving one person or many, they should always choose the second option. But at some point, that rule was perverted, becoming the sacrifice of one to save many. The heroes never had to face all the consequences and deaths they caused, whether it was truly an accident or if they were doing it for fun. They were individuals who were not strangers to villains, protected by the mask of heroes. Then, we would see Jade at a party night, accompanied by two women. Behind him, the mysterious girl with silver hair and a red jacket was following him. The narrator would comment that if the job of the heroes was to eliminate corrupt and evil villains, we would wonder who would take care of eliminating these corrupt heroes. And as the girl tried to enter, one of the guards would try to stop her, but she would quickly subdue him and throw him to the ground. Then, she would start fighting against the other Awardia, managing to knock him down to enter the building. Once inside, we would hear Jade talking about another character he used to hate but who was now dead. Jade would try to flirt with the two girls accompanying him. At that moment, Jade would notice the presence of the girl with silver hair, whom he would try to attack, but she would manage to dodge his attack. Jade would complain that she had come to ruin everything and would realize that she was just a little girl. The girl would tell him that he wasn't as fast as they said, surprising Jade, who would see his arm wounded by a couple of forks and knives, which would make him furious. Then, Jade would start interrogating the girl, asking her if she was a member of the villain organization. But it didn't matter because he planned to eliminate her anyway. Then, we would see a flashback of the girl as a child, holding the lifeless body of a woman, and then the man in the wooden wheelchair would appear, asking her if she wanted revenge. She would respond yes, and he would ask her how she planned to find the hero who killed her sister, to which she would reply that she would kill them all and eventually find them. Returning to the present, the girl would be in combat using objects found in the place, and despite the speed demonstrated by the hero, she would manage to block and dodge several of his blows. However, little by little, he would prevail over her and ask her if that was all she had. With great effort, she would continue fighting using all the objects at her disposal to defend herself. But Jade, with his abilities, would manage to knock down the girl with silver hair. He would ask her if she thought she was the first villain to challenge him and would start beating her on the ground. He would say that he was going to kill them all, and just when he was about to kill her, he would have an illusion in which he saw himself chained under a guillotine, making him break into a cold sweat. Returning to reality, Jade would see that the girl was holding his hand, causing him to step back. He would ask her what she had just shown him, and the girl would say that when she finally hit him, she understood how his power worked. Then, she would proceed to imitate him, tearing a piece of Jade's shoulder, causing him to cry out in pain and bleed. The hero would make a comment about her just toying with him and would launch himself at her. However, he would only receive one blow from the girl before trying to escape. But on the way, he would be intercepted by the girl, who would grab him by the face and kill him by slamming his head against the ground, saying that in his next life, she hoped he would come back as a decent human being. The man in the wooden wheelchair warned the girl with silver hair that the heroes would start chasing her, that those who pursue her would be stronger. She said they could all come, and she would kill them all one by one. After the incident, several agents would arrive at the crime scene where Jade had died. They would be discussing the fact that they had found someone to replace Jade, surprising one of them, as they hadn't even buried Jade yet. Another police officer would say that he already knew how these things worked, so one of them would comment that they hoped this time it would be a normal hero. At that moment, a man with red hair would quickly appear in the room and sniff the blood like a maniac. He would start screaming and talking to Jade's corpse, asking who had killed him. After saying craziness into the air, he would lick the blood from Jade's body and start having visions of what had happened, seeing the face of our protagonist, and saying with a lunatic look that he found her. This madman was called Chaos. In another place, we would see the girl with silver hair training, and she would explain that the heroes accept the orders they receive from the hero clan. Long ago, after defeating the villains in the war, they slowly established their dominion of power. Hundreds of years later, the world was practically under their control. While taking a bath, the girl would think that a week had passed since she killed Jade, but the media hadn't said anything about it. She wondered if maybe they didn't want to show weakness or if she was disposable to them, like Iwa, her sister. But in the end, she thought it didn't matter as long as she started making their members disappear, they couldn't ignore her. She would look at a photo of Jade on a mural full of other photos, thinking that they could send whoever they wanted. She would arrive at her job at a bar, apologizing for the delay, and the owner would call her by her name, Iwa, greeting her. She would comment that it seemed like there were no customers again today, and she wasn't complaining about it. The bar owner would mention that there was one there, which would surprise Iwa. The man would ask her if she was always so sarcastic and would tell her that he would go check the inventory. At that moment, the girl would see the customer, who turned out to be Chaos. He would point a gun at the bar owner while looking at Iwa. Surprised, the protagonist, using Jade's powers, would quickly appear next to Chaos and twist his arm so that he wouldn't harm the bar owner. Chaos would tell her to calm down and that he had only come to say hello. With a knife at her throat, Chaos would mention that Iwa was too pretty to be someone so cold. She would ask him if the hero clan had sent him, to which Chaos would think that she was calm and beautiful, and she had just used Jade's gift, deducing that her gift was to steal the gifts of others. After taking a sip of his coffee, Chaos would ask her why she wasn't wielding that knife. After slightly cutting Chaos' neck, he would tell her to meet him at a place tomorrow and hand her a paper, telling her to go alone. The bar owner would return and ask what had happened, to which Iwa would respond that nothing had happened, throwing away the paper that said the words Area C with the time 12 p.m. Moments later, we would see a city practically destroyed and in ruins, where Iwa would walk alone among the rubble. Suddenly, she would stop and turn in a direction, realizing that Chaos was aiming at her with a sniper rifle from a building several meters away. Chaos would mention that realizing that was incredible and would pull the trigger. Quickly, Iwa would crouch down to protect herself from the bullets behind an object, observing that, based on the bullet trajectory, it must have come from someone who was watching a certain building. She would then take a steel ball slingshot out of her pocket and, using Jade's power, she would launch those steel balls, managing to bring down a column of the building where Chaos was. Chaos would comment that it was impressive, thinking that she was a problem. At that moment, Iwa would prepare herself and start using Jade's power towards the building where Chaos was. He would say that the clan wanted all that fun to be lost, an idea that annoyed him. He would use the sniper rifle again to aim at the street, but he would realize that Iwa wasn't there anymore. A noise coming from the building would make him realize that she had already reached him using Jade's lightning power. Chaos would try to load a shotgun to shoot Iwa, but she would quickly deflect the shot. Chaos would try to load and shoot again, but it would be deflected once more. She would try to pull out more weapons to kill Iwa, but she would manage to disarm him and put him in a tight spot. Iwa would grab the machete that was in Chaos' chest, preparing to kill him. However, an object capable of swimming through cement would come out of the walls, but Iwa would narrowly dodge it. As she attempted to cut Chaos' body, he would dodge her, and a man with the gift of being able to pass through things, whom she would narrowly evade, would quickly analyze her and realize that he could pass through objects but not living beings. She would understand that as she grabbed his hand and tried to throw him to the ground with a lock, but he would quickly respond, which would only provoke a kick from Iwa that would send him backward, revealing his face, and that he was a fellow hero named Viper. Iwa would tell Chaos that he had said it would only be the two of them, to which Chaos would play dumb and ask if she wouldn't use Jade's gift, to which Iwa wouldn't respond. Chaos would mention that it's not that he didn't want to use it, but he couldn't anymore. An intense fight would begin between Iwa and Viper, where Chaos would say that she must have a limited recovery period. But it didn't matter because Viper was as good as him but used different methods. Then Chaos would say that if she had nothing else to show him, she was going to die. Iwa would proceed to fight against Viper, delivering a blow that would weaken her and knock her to the ground. But in a surprising move, Iwa would start using Viper's gift to phase through the ground and escape, which would surprise both heroes. Chaos would think that he only had to touch someone to gain Viper's gift. He would then tell her that they didn't have time to stand around, as they wanted to catch her, and they should pursue her. Afterward, he would say that this girl was the reason Chaos had called him without reporting to the clan, but for some reason, she gave him a bad feeling. Chaos would respond by saying that it was good that he had called him, and both of them would prepare to hunt down Iwa, who was hiding in the city. Iwa would think that she had been naive to believe that Chaos wouldn't bring reinforcements, and she realized that Viper was not only strong but that she didn't know how to counter his gift. She realized that she was not in a good situation and would have to kill Chaos first. At one point, Viper would hear a noise and quickly jump towards it, thinking it was Iwa. However, upon arriving at the location, he would realize that it was a trap that Iwa had set for Chaos, ready to kill him, but he would retaliate by using his weapons to try to kill her. However, she would deflect the bullets from Chaos' gun using her own and throw a knife, stabbing Chaos in the shoulder. Then, she would stand in front of him, ready to kill him with a slash to the neck, but she would narrowly miss. When she was about to deliver the final blow, Viper would appear behind her and hit her on the head, knocking her unconscious. Then, Iwa wouldn't have time to react, and Viper would appear behind her again, grabbing her by the throat, ready to kill her. Meanwhile, a girl would be watching them from a distance while talking to another person in a black trench coat. She would think and say that she had to save her, even if it meant confronting the hero clan. The boy would respond that the girl, referring to Iwa, had great potential. On her own, Iwa would manage to break free from Viper's grip, but just barely, and she would run towards Chaos, who had used Viper's body to try to harm Iwa with his shotgun. They had managed to slightly injure the girl, piercing her body. At that moment, Chaos would throw a grenade that would stun Iwa and distract her, causing her to be hit by Viper and knocked down, but not killed. Viper, thinking that he now understood how she killed Jade, would be annoyed and think that it would be worse if they let her go. He would think that it was important to kill her before it was too late. However, at that moment, he would turn around and see an unknown person standing beside him. He would try to ask who the hell he was, but he would be killed before he could finish his sentence. At the same time, Iwa would fall to the ground, asking who they were. A blonde girl with pigtails who would ask who else could it be, saying that they were the villains. All of this would be observed by Chaos, who was hiding in the rubble. After a while, we would see Iwa lying in a hospital bed, being attended by a doctor who was about to give her some supplements. Unaware that Iwa would appear behind him, saying that wasn't the way to treat someone who saved her life, but she would ask who they were. The doctor would explain to Iwa that they were the Nameless, the survivors of the Great War between the hero clan and the villains, although only one of them had fought in the war. The doctor would introduce himself as Vector and ask Iwa if she should be more grateful to him for saving her life. At that moment, the blonde girl would enter with a basket, surprised to see Iwa awake. She would then tell her that their boss wanted to see her and that they should all go together. She would start eating one of the apples that the blonde girl had brought and mentioned that Iwa looked very calm, saying that she could have poisoned the apple, to which Iwa would respond that poison doesn't affect her much, surprising the girl. Then, the blonde girl would ask her what she did with the heart, to which the protagonist would respond that she ate it, causing laughter from the blonde girl, and saying that she was funny. As they walked, Iwa would think that she had already regained her strength to use her gifts again, and they were probably filling her up by taking her with her companions. Iwa would think about trying to escape, and she knew she could defeat Vector, but the problem was whether she would be able to defeat the girl, reflecting on what she should do next. The blonde girl would interrupt Iwa's thoughts and tell her that they had arrived, welcoming her to the hideout of the Nameless, where the leader and a giant were waiting. The blonde girl would introduce herself as Rachel Sin Sinclairi. The giant was named John Nash, and the leader was named Ingen, and upon seeing Ingen, she would think he looked dangerous. On the other hand, in the hero clan, a man in a suit would meet with Chaos, who would complain that the latter had let Viper die. Chaos would say that there was nothing more to be done since the enemies were too strong. The man in the suit would say that Viper had a lot of potential, and that the higher-ups had invested a lot in him, and he didn't think they would forgive Chaos for that mistake. And he would mention that he also wanted to discuss that matter with him, asking if he could do something about it. The man would respond that Chaos should have never been the division director, and that he missed the days when he was doing fieldwork. Then he would ask who was behind all of this, to which Chaos would respond that it was Ingen. The subject would think about that name for a few seconds, wondering where he had heard it before. But then, surprised, he would drop the fan he was holding and ask if he was referring to the smiling man. Chaos would respond affirmatively. The subject would turn around and start walking away, to which Chaos would ask where he was going. The subject would only respond by asking why he hadn't mentioned it before and that now Chaos was alone. He would think that they were now on high alert and would have to call all the heroes from the division, as the smiling man had returned. Returning to the villains, Ingen would say that enough talking had been done and would ask aloud who was going to do it. Rachel would say that she wanted to be the one. Then she would take out a saw and mention that she had been waiting for that moment. Suddenly, she would attack Iwa, but she would manage to dodge the attacks thrown by Rachel, who would continue attacking with a smile. However, Iwa would stop her and deliver a powerful punch to the face, followed by a kick that would make Rachel drop her weapon. Rachel would be thrown against the wall and receive a knee strike from the silver-haired girl. Rachel would start laughing and accept defeat, raising her hand for Iwa to help her up. All of this would be observed by the doctor, who would notice that Iwa was not someone normal. Iwa would then ask them why they had saved her and what they hoped to achieve by doing so. Ingen would respond to Iwa that his objective was to defeat the Hero Clan, who were also responsible for the death of his sister. Iwa, activating Jade's powers, would ask how they knew that. At that moment, we would see a memory in which Ingen entered a church and spoke to the subject sitting in a wooden chair. This man would tell Ingen that if he wondered why he, an old failure, was calling him, and Ingen would respond that it would be a lie if he said he didn't. Then, this man would mention that there was someone he wanted Ingen to help. Ingen would ask if he had grown fond of the beast he had been training, to which this man would respond that Ingen had become more arrogant since the last time. Afterward, this man would hold a sword in his hand and with a terrifying face, he would ask Ingen if he was ready to talk. Ingen would think that even a toothless tiger was still a fierce beast and, taking a seat, he would say that for now, he would listen to what this man had to say. Then, he would begin to talk about Iwa, and he would tell Ingen that she was a natural fighter with great willpower, and that she was destined to be very important. But she was not yet ready, and if she faced something stronger than her, she would probably die. Ingen would assume that the man in the wheelchair wanted him to take care of that puppy of his, and the man would tell him that his goal was clear, to destroy the Hero Clan. However, he would tell him that eventually he would have to face that girl, something he should already know since he was also in the war. It didn't matter if he eliminated all the heroes, if he couldn't do something about her, she would become the cause of his downfall. With a hand on his face, Ingen would ask if this man was saying that this hero killer could reach the level of that woman, and this man would respond that maybe, managing to convince Ingen to accept it, but that he wouldn't be responsible if she ended up dying. To which this man would say that he taught her everything he knew and hoped that she wouldn't kill him. Returning to the present, Ingen would ask Iwa if she really wanted to find the culprit and avenge her family, or if she just wanted to fight to the death. Iwa would tell him that he hadn't answered the question and would ask him again how he knew about her sister. At that moment, suddenly, the giant would attack Iwa, but at the last second, he would be stopped by shadows on his body. Ingen would draw John's attention, who would respond that he was talking to her. Iwa would observe the four of them and ask if they called themselves the Nameless and how it was possible that such a group of misfits didn't collapse. John would tell Iwa that he wouldn't be so kind next time, while the doctor tried to side with Iwa to calm the situation. Rachel would ask Vector why they were doing it and would ask him to let them have some fun. Then Iwa would realize that the Nameless didn't seem willing to answer her question, and after thinking for a moment, she would come to the conclusion that they probably needed her for a specific task. She would realize that her opponents had something that they didn't have, information. That meant there was a limit to what they could negotiate, and no matter what they offered her, she would have to accept it. She believed that it was best for her to take the initiative. She would say that she believed she knew what they wanted from them, and she understood that in exchange for her strength, the Nameless would be willing to give her the answer she was looking for. Then she would ask them what they were planning. Vector would then respond that they were planning to destroy the Hero Clan. Iwa would be surprised and would think it must be a joke, considering that there were only 4 of them. But Ingen would say that once she joined, they would be 5. Elsewhere, in a desert, a voice would be heard asking about an agenda. A woman with blue hair would respond that it was complete for the next 2 weeks and that after dealing with the villains, they would have a publicity photo shoot. A girl in red clothing would complain about it, and the secretary would apologize, but the other woman would respond saying it wasn't her fault. It would be revealed that the girl in red was Victoria, and she would tell what seemed to be her secretary that it wasn't easy being the face of the Hero Clan. Meanwhile, a tremor would start to be felt in the place. Victoria would mention that it seemed they were already arriving. In the distance, a cloud of smoke would be seen approaching, and that cloud would turn out to be an army of villains in vans threatening to burn everything in their path. And in front of them, they would see the silhouette of a woman, and they would think they could simply run her over. Victoria would take her sword and ask if there were any reporters or cameras. Her secretary would respond that there were none. Victoria, wielding her sword, would think that she didn't need to hold back, as her eyes started to glow. She would swing her sword towards the villains, cutting many of them in half along with the mountain behind them. A massive explosion would erupt, opening up the skies and leaving the place in silence. Then Victoria would think that when all of that was over, a drink in the 17th Division would do her good. John would ask if it was wise to leave Iwa like that without any further action. Then he would ask Claire why she hadn't used her power, to which she would respond that she didn't want to kill Iwa since she liked her and found her cute. Claire didn't want to go straight to the point and preferred to be more subtle in her approach. Meanwhile, Vector would think that she had fallen for their act, but he knew that every move she made was calculated. Although she seemed angry, Vector believed it was just an act. Sinclair would ask how he knew that, and Vector would tell her it was because of her pulse. From the moment he saw her in the infirmary until she left the hideout, her pulse never changed. Sinclair would mention that it was the opposite of Ingen, as he seemed calm on the outside but was the opposite on the inside. Before Sinclair could finish her sentence, Ingen would interrupt her and say that he had made a decision. He would announce that the hero killer would join the assault on the 17th Division. Sinclair would accept his decision, and Ingen would tell John not to attack unless ordered to. Otherwise, he would personally kill him. And after that, Vector and Sinclair would go grab something to eat. Elsewhere, Iwa would be training her body. She would think that Ingen was on a much higher level of power than Viper, but there were still much stronger heroes than Ingen. She would wonder if she would be able to reach that level. She would train the powers she had stolen from Jade, and she would notice that now she could use the power for 7 minutes, which was an improvement compared to the previous day. But it still wasn't enough. She would remember the day her sister died and her sister's last words, that Iwa had to survive. She would think that this was just the beginning and that her ability improved every time she stole an opponent's powers. Her mind would practice cutting shadows and creatures, thinking that they would be stepping stones to reach the top. After her training, Iwa would go to a bar where the owner would ask her if she had been in a fight. At first, she would consider denying it, but then she would decide to tell the truth. The owner would hand her a broom and tell her that he would leave the rest to her while they cleaned. The bar owner would ask if the person at the window was her friend, referring to Chaos. Without saying a word, Iwa would push the bar owner and break the glass, punching Chaos in the face. Then she would take him down with a weapon she had hidden on her body and prepare to kill him. But in reality, all of this was her imagination, and she would realize that Chaos came unarmed, so she would take off her uniform, telling the owner that she would be back in a minute. In a nearby park, Chaos would offer Iwa a drink, telling her that flavor would suit her well, offering her a cold mint drink, a joke that would annoy Iwa. While Chaos drank his beverage, he would say that he didn't expect Iwa to accept his invitation, but she would only think about the person at the bar. Chaos would assure her not to worry about him, mentioning that last time he was just joking and that he wasn't even armed now. Iwa would think that she didn't know Chaos's intentions or motivations, so she would ask him what he wanted exactly, asking if he wanted to avenge Viper's death, but then she would think that probably wasn't the case. Taking a seat, Iwa would ask Chaos what he really wanted, and Chaos would respond that he wouldn't beat around the bush and would tell her that he wanted her to be his partner. To this, Iwa, with a neutral tone, would ask him what he was talking about, which would make Chaos laugh. Iwa would tell him to stop with the jokes, but Chaos would stop her and tell her he was serious. At that moment, Chaos would begin mentioning some superhero abilities, such as shape-shifting, fire manipulation, and others. And he would explain that these abilities were characteristics of the Chosen Ones, gifts that those who possessed this power had. He would also mention that those who had these gifts also had notably resilient bodies and could live longer than regular humans. But ironically, not many of them survived to die of natural causes. In another scene, a doctor would be talking to Chaos in a morgue, asking if Viper had been his partner for 10 years and mentioning that it must be painful. This doctor seemed to be a close friend of Viper's and would say that despite her gloomy appearance, she recognized Viper's bright personality. Chaos would tell her that he would remedy the situation and seemed to have been exploring Iwa's mind. Then, they would see the villain's hideout, and the doctor would mention that it didn't seem to bother Chaos in the least. Despite having promised to do him a small favor later, Chaos would indicate that it was time to go. Before leaving, he would take Viper's goggles, saying that he had always wanted to use them, and he would tell whoever stayed there to leave, as he felt that something bad was about to happen, thinking that Iwa was truly a threat since she had become very strong in a short time. Our protagonist would then be maintaining her weapons, but then she would receive a message saying that the time had come, so she would quickly head to a certain place. There, two guards would be chatting calmly until suddenly, one of them would ask who was there, realizing that there was nothing, and thinking that maybe it was an animal. But then Iwa appeared behind him to incapacitate both him and the other guard. Then Iwa would threaten to kill him if they didn't keep their mouths shut. She would ask for his radio, to which the guard would comply. Iwa would break the guard's radio with a single strike, then smash his head against the ground. Recalling the meeting with Ingen, Iwa would ask if they had a plan. Ingen would say that ideally, they would incapacitate the guards since their leader was a retired hero, and it was best to get rid of him so that he wouldn't cause problems later. Sinclair would wonder if it was worth wasting time with him, but Iwa understood that it was better to quickly eliminate all loose ends before attracting the attention of the hero clan. Then Rachel would try to offer herself to take care of him, but Iwa would interrupt her by offering herself first. This was because they didn't trust her, and it was her chance to earn their trust. Ingen would ask if she wanted something in return, to which our protagonist, without thinking much, would say that she wanted his power. Back in the present, walking down a corridor filled with the bodies of guards, was Iwa, being watched by Grayman through the cameras, asking if she had killed them all. At that moment, Iwa would enter and tell him that she wasn't sure, but he was about to die. Grayman, without saying much more, would throw his axe at her, which Iwa would manage to catch in midair and strike back, but it would be dodged by Grayman. Then Iwa would tell him that he didn't have to hold back and to attack her with all he had, getting into a fighting stance. Grayman would comply and launch a powerful attack, leaving claw marks on the walls. He and Iwa would engage in a fight where it seemed like Iwa had the upper hand, repeatedly striking Grayman. However, the blows would prove ineffective, and Grayman would grab Iwa by the foot, throwing her against a wall in the next room. Before she could react, Grayman would appear in front of her again and strike her in the face. However, in the next moment of the fight, Iwa would try to counterattack and manage to bring Grayman down. He would, however, break free with sheer brute force. Grayman would consider that Iwa had unconventional but clever moves, and she had the right physique to execute them. He would also believe that Iwa was an excellent fighter, talented and with tough training, thinking about how she became like that. But it didn't matter, as now she was standing in front of him, and he would slowly break her. Grayman would think that he still had the advantage because he hadn't yet understood who was better in this fight. Iwa would think that if she wanted to, she could have easily killed him, but she didn't because she wanted to use her power. She knew that he was on a higher level. The fight would continue, and it seemed like Iwa was in the lead, managing to hit Grayman, while thinking that he was nothing more than an appetizer for her. After kicking Grayman and making him crash into a wall, taking advantage of this moment to think about the fight, explaining that she knew that battles between people with powers depended on who controlled their energy called EST better, and not everyone with powers had an adequate EST reserve. Some powers required a lot of energy, while others did not. Jade and Viper were examples of power users with different levels of energy. Iwa knew that she could only use Jade's power for more than 7 minutes, but she could only use Viper's power for a few seconds. If she wasn't careful, she could end up dead from exhaustion of using her power too much. Then Grayman would stand up, activating his power and resuming the fight. But Iwa would strategically use her power to put Grayman in a tight spot until finally defeating him. But he would start using his power in a desperate way and launched an attack against our protagonist, who would deliver a final blow. She would think that Jade was very weak and Ingen too powerful. Meanwhile, Grayman, injured and on the ground, insulting Iwa, would ask if she dared to fight against the hero clan and question why she did what she did. But she would tell him that it didn't matter because she knew that he would end up worse than her. She would tell him that maybe that's the case, but when she died, there would be nothing left of him. Gray, desperate, would beg her to let him live, but she would simply tell him to open his eyes, that he was about to die. Then she would release him, letting him fall from that great height to his death. She would test the new ability she had stolen from Grayman, and then she would start to escape from the place. Suddenly, she would jump between two buildings and see a figure in an alley, a woman wearing a trench coat and a cap covering her face. The woman would take off the cap, revealing herself to be Victoria, who would wonder what had happened, seeing Iwa jumping between the buildings. Surprised, our protagonist would notice that Victoria suddenly appeared in front of her, greeting her with a slight flick of her finger that sent her flying. While our protagonist was on the ground, Victoria would realize that she had blocked the attack. As she descended to the ground where Iwa was, noticing the smell of blood, she would ask who Iwa had just massacred. Iwa would reply that she didn't care, and Victoria would say that she had a pleasant voice that made her want to rip her throat out. Then it would be explained to us that Victoria was among the top 9 most powerful heroes and that they are not subject to the laws of the hero clan. They have the world in their hands, and among them is Victoria. Victoria, coming from the era before heroes and villains, was a monster in Iwa's words. She would realize that, realistically, she couldn't defeat her. However, she could make Victoria drop her guard, and with that, she would have a chance. Using Jade's powers, she would throw a punch that would be easy for Victoria to dodge, which would surprise Iwa. Victoria would ask her what she intended to do by trying to hit her, aware that she didn't like her and that she didn't stand a chance. Victoria would ask Iwa if she preferred deaf, and Iwa would murmur something unintelligible. We would see a flashback of the conversation between Ingen and Iwa, where he would tell her that using her power wouldn't be easy, and that if she wasn't careful, it would cost her everything, and especially to be careful at night. Returning to the present, Iwa would use Ingen's power and create a huge storm of shadows that would envelop everything. But this would be nothing for Victoria, who, using her power, would easily brush it off, only to realize that Iwa had disappeared, and she would wonder who that power reminded her of. Vector and Sinclair would be talking about how devastated they were and thinking that the security chief was stronger than they expected, and they would see Iwa waking up. Mockingly, Sinclair would ask Iwa if she recognized that place, but the first thing Iwa would say upon waking up would be that she was hungry, surprising everyone. But she would repeat her request for food. Iwa would eat non-stop, noticing that she was almost completely recovered and that her forearm no longer hurt. However, Iwa would ask if everything was ready, to which Sinclair would respond that only one thing was missing. According to Ingen, the heroes of the 17th Division were gradually gathering, and when they were all gathered in the same building, all that was left was to make everything explode. With Grayman dead, they surely increased security, and Iwa would ask where they would get so many explosives. At that moment, Ingen would mention not to worry about that, and that he knew someone. Later, we would see a guy talking to himself, asking who the hell would order 2 boxes of a drink called Ming Tiu Du. And we would see that this guy was in front of the villain's hideout with those 2 boxes of the drink. Ringing the doorbell, he would announce that the delivery had arrived, and he would be received by the villains. With a smile, he would wonder if he was going to die. He would leave the box on the floor and turn around to run. All the villains would be sent to capture that guy, and using his power, he would try to escape. Then he would notice that he was starting to tremble, and he would wonder if it was because of his power. Then, Iwa would throw a metal ball using Jade's power, managing to destabilize the guy. With the second attack, she would knock him to the ground, but quickly the guy would recover, only to see John approaching him and attempting to strike him. But the guy would manage to dodge. When John was about to deliver the final blow, the guy would disappear and reappear, asking if it was necessary to attack him. After asking this, he would quickly see John appearing in front of him and Iwa behind him. The guy, acting arrogant, would say that he didn't know what they wanted, but that he wasn't there to play. He would ask if they really believed they could match his speed, but Iwa would tell him that he was a liar, and that if he were that fast, he would have already escaped. She would say that his real power was becoming invisible when he flipped a coin, and that if she didn't catch the coin, he couldn't use his power for a while. The guy would wonder how the hell Iwa guessed that, but would think that it wasn't over. He would toss a bunch of coins into the air, and as the guy was about to catch the coin, Iwa would intercept him and deliver a strong punch to his face, sending him flying. Our protagonist would say that it was an interesting power, but would ask if that was all. The guy would say no and that he still had a trump card up his sleeve. He would think that even though they discovered how his power worked, he couldn't defeat them, so he would accept the price to get out of there. Then he would scatter a bunch of coins and jump between buildings to escape from that place. And as he ran, he would complain about losing all his money. But he would end up being intercepted by Sinclair, realizing that she was the girl who had opened the door. Then, holding Sinclair's arm, vines with flowers would start to emerge, but the guy would say that it was easy to dodge. However, he would realize that the vines were chasing him, and they would eventually pierce through his chest. Suddenly, he would open his eyes and see that he was in a forest, where there were several wooden bodies that looked like wooden statues. The guy would wonder where he was and would hear a voice asking if he didn't think he was in her garden. The voice would tell him that it took a lot of energy to use her power, and she didn't use it much. At that moment, a woman dressed in green would appear and tell him that there were only 2 ways to leave: wait for her to let him go or kill her. She would comment that the guy didn't seem to be a very strong fighter and ask him what he was going to do, implying that she wanted to play a game while showing him a terrifying sword that looked alive, with eyes and teeth. Then it would be told to us about a company called Chain Logos, which appeared to be a common distributor, but there were many rumors about them. It was said that they could deliver anything for the right price, and that they ranked among the top 10 most important industries. However, the company's boss, Chain, was a complete mystery. We would see the same speedster guy being welcomed into what seemed to be a secret hideout, saying that he wanted to talk to the boss. When the door opened, they would see John coming along with him and he would kill the guy who opened the door. They would walk down the hallway, and Sinclair would ask if they were being led into a trap, to which the guy would respond that they weren't, and that it was a little further ahead. In that place, they would encounter a guy who apparently was the boss of all this, wondering what had happened. The guy would tell the boss that some people wanted to talk to him while grabbing the collar of his shirt, a detail that the boss would notice. Then, the boss would order all the employees in the place to kill the ones who had attacked this employee. At that moment, InGen would activate his power and easily kill all the employees. While he was close to killing the company's boss, the guy would say that they needed explosives to deal with the 17th Division. However, at that moment, he would realize that this person wasn't Chain, as another guy would come out from another room, complaining that they were interrupting his fun and asking what they were doing bothering his lackeys. The guy with green hair and a yellow jacket would appear as the real Chain, who would recognize InGen and be terrified that he was there. And while they were talking, Iwa would wonder what kind of relationship these two had. At that moment, Rachel would step in front of the protagonist and ask him what he was thinking, to which Iwa would say nothing. But then Sinclair would start telling her that they both fought together in the war, and that he had heard that InGen saved Chain's life on one occasion. Chain would ask InGen if he was serious about infiltrating the 17th Division, and that he didn't want to get involved in that dangerous mission. InGen would respond that he didn't want Chain to get fully involved, he just needed the explosives. Chain, on the other hand, would ask if he had any idea how long it took him to build everything from scratch, but trembling, he would tell him to forget it and that he had come too far to throw everything away, and that if he helped them, he would probably kill him. Then our protagonist interrupts them, surprising InGen, who thought she wouldn't interfere. Chain would ask who she was, and InGen would introduce her as the hero killer, his ace in the hole. Chain would mock that villain alias, but InGen would interrupt, saying that he had already killed 2 heroes, and they could add his name to the list. He would threaten Chain, telling him to stop wasting their time and deliver the explosives. Then, they would mention that they were playing video games with the guy who had been guided before, the first guy who had encountered these villains. While Chain was playing a video game, this other guy would ask him if it was right to help those guys. However, Chain would tell the guy that if he hadn't intervened, they would have been killed, as InGen had no scruples. At that moment, the guy would question Chain about the amount of explosives, as it wouldn't be enough to destroy the last division, and he would mention that it would only provoke the wrath of the hero clan. Chain would respond to the guy that they could simply apologize to the heroes and explain that the terrorists forced them to cooperate with them. He would ask if the nameless ones could really defeat the hero clan, to which Chain would respond that, from his perspective, it was practically impossible. However, he would remember that InGen had whispered something to him that he couldn't believe. The guy would continue questioning and ask if they could defeat the 17th Division. Chain would respond that if they accomplished that feat, remaining silent afterward, while the guy and his employees would respond the same, thinking about the profits. However, Chain would be scared and ask what they would do. Elsewhere, a person would be seen trying to reach for some medicine, but clumsily dropping it on the floor. Then, it would be revealed that the person was the doctor, and the medicine would fall to her feet. Cow's body would be full of wounds, and he would ask the doctor when she had arrived. She would respond that it was now. The doctor would examine his body while applying medical equipment. At that moment, the doctor would say that there was no reason to continue doing that and that it was never too late to retire. Cows would grab the doctor and push her against the wall, telling her that it was not yet the time. The doctor would respond that if it wasn't the time, then she would increase his dosage, but that it would only be a temporary measure, as his recovery capacity was diminishing, and he had fought for a long time, telling him that he couldn't fight anymore. Cows would say that he didn't care and that he just wanted to know how this war would end. The doctor would tell him that the war had already ended, but Cows would claim that it had never ended while looking at something from the window, saying that it seemed like the new reinforcements had arrived. These reinforcements were 3 heroes, a girl named Sharpshooter, a guy named Claymore, and another named Stonefirst. Stonefirst would say that it had been a long time since they were last there and would wonder where the welcoming committee was. Sharpshooter would comment that it seemed like the division's director had given them something and would mention that it was said that some villains were planning to infiltrate that place, adding that they were told that Grayman, Jade, and Viper had been killed. Claymore would say that he felt sorry for Viper, who he liked. At that moment, the director of the 17th edition would tell them that they had finally arrived. There would be a transition to another place where the guy who had worked for Chain and had met the villains would wonder why there were no guards in one of the hero clan's bases. However, he would mention that he didn't care as he was making a special delivery, as his van was filled with explosives. In a meeting between the heroes and the director, one of them would ask if only they had arrived, as they weren't even half. The girl would tell him to stop waiting and that they also had things to do. Stormfist would say that Sharpshooter was right in mentioning that the 17th edition was relatively small, and he would say that it was normal for some to go to other divisions, but this seemed like a serious matter, so it could be fun. The girl would correct him, saying it was just a joke. The guy with glasses would say that they were talking about the Smiling Man, and he would ask if it was something important in the war, revealing his power to cover his skin with rock. Then he would say that it was their chance to finish him off and ask if they didn't find it exciting. The girl would say that it was good practice, but Claymore would ask him to stop, as it was actually a serious matter. The guy with glasses would pat Claymore's back, telling him it wasn't a big deal, and that the Smiling Man was just a ghost from the past, asking the smoking boss if he was right since he had fought in the war. The smoker would call him an idiot and ask the Dr. Yuna about Kao's situation. Sharpshooter would mention that Viper had died and question how it was possible that Kao's hadn't, hinting that maybe he didn't have what it took to be a hero. The doctor would tell her not to underestimate Kao's, and that he was a better hero than she would ever be. Annoyed, Sharpshooter would point her gun at the doctor, but at that moment, the whole place would start to shake. Sharpshooter would say that only low-ranking soldiers were left, but it seemed like a fight was happening. Then, everything would start to explode. The smoker would say that he knew something like this would happen, and that there was no need to panic, telling everyone to prepare for battle. Meanwhile, Victoria's secretary would be watching a musical in which Victoria was participating, noticing that she was playing her music angrily. After the recital, Victoria would sit down and have a conversation with her secretary, whom she would call Hecate. Victoria would wonder about the smoker, and seeing that he wasn't answering, she would realize that they could be in trouble. But she was sure that the situation would explode at any moment. But Hecate would tell her that it was already happening, pointing outside as the hero's building was engulfed in flames, and she would ask if Victoria found it exciting. Victoria would observe this with a macabre smile. Meanwhile, the protagonist would say that it seemed like Chain had betrayed them, and what would they do? And Ingen would say that they should just kill anyone who stood in their way. As they approached, Sharpshooter would quickly shoot at the villains, but this shot would be easily deflected by Iwa. Then, Ingen would send John to kill the heroes, and he would start running towards them at full speed, running on walls. But he would be intercepted by the heroes, who launched themselves to attack him in the air, and bring him back down to the ground. The protagonist would join the fight but would end up surrounded by the heroes, but with Sinclair's help, she would manage to free herself. Facing each other on the stairs of the valley, the blonde would ask our protagonist who she wanted to fight, to which she would respond that she would go against Claymore. She would then toss a coin to the ground, and she would disappear for a moment, only to kick Claymore to another place. As they fought, their swords clashed, and suddenly our protagonist's sword started to rust. At that moment, the guy would explain that his power was to rust weapons, and therefore no conventional weapon would work against him. He would then proceed to summon a sword made of light. This would make Claymore think, believing it was Victoria's power. Then the protagonist would explain her power, saying that she had 2 types of abilities, temporary ones that she stole from people and permanent ones. Explaining that to have a permanent ability, she had to kill the original owner with her own hands. Both resumed their fight, this time with Iwa's sword being able to withstand Claymore's power. But then, everyone would stop their fights to witness how terrifying the power of the Smiling Man was, who was using shadows to climb up to the floor where the director was. But upon reaching there, the man would say that he was too confident in climbing up, knowing it was a trap. Then, the place would completely change, turning into a smoke-filled area. Smoke fishes would start devouring the dark flames emanating from Ingen's body. Then, the smoker would appear, saying that those fishes would devour all of Ingen's energy. Ingen would say that it was a mistake to set the trap there since, after all, the sun didn't reach that place, and with his power, he would destroy it. Meanwhile, in Sinclair's fight, she would effortlessly dodge sharpshooter's attacks, who would say that she didn't want to ruin her nails, but Rachel would respond that they weren't a big deal, which would anger the crossbow girl. Then, she would shoot a purple arrow into the sky, which would change its trajectory when it fell near Rachel. She would explain that her sixth shot always hit the target, and that was her power. The blonde would think that this was difficult and that she should have gone to fight Claymore, thinking that Yua probably wouldn't want to change now. Then, the crossbow girl would shoot at the blonde again, starting a bombardment while Rachel tried to dodge the attacks, thinking about how to approach in some way. At that moment, she would realize that she was standing near an explosive trap that would explode near her, and she would realize that it might have been part of the crossbow girl's plan. She would then give her a new arrow that would pierce her shoulder, and the crossbow girl would ask her what was wrong, noticing that the blonde fell silent. But the blonde would say that there was no problem, she was just lost in her thoughts. Sharpshooter would say that she was getting tired of her talk, to which the blonde would respond that she wasn't. Then, Sinclair would think that it was difficult to get close to her but that she couldn't just keep receiving arrows. The blonde would realize that her normal shots were the most powerful, but she couldn't aim directly, which would make her think that she had only one option left, to run towards her. She would then throw her weapon at her, but the crossbow girl would easily dodge it and start shooting at the blonde, who would evade and count the arrows until they finally reached the close combat, with the sixth arrow ready to attack. However, the whole situation would turn out to be a trap, as Sharpshooter's sixth shot was a real arrow and not a special one. At that distance, it was impossible for the blonde to dodge that shot, and she would be hit, injuring her arm, causing her to fall to the ground exhausted due to blood loss, thinking that this was the end, even though she still had many things to do. Next, we would start seeing memories of a snowy place called Grey Castle, in Area 55 during the time of the Civil War. There were many orphans and unfortunate children abandoned in poverty, and they didn't have many options other than stealing to survive. Grey Castle was not a welcoming place, and many orphans had to resort to theft to survive, making the residents of the place stronger. In that place, the strong rays of the sun reflected on the icy snow-covered ground, and we would see a cart to which a person was tied, wondering how they ended up like this, and that it all started with a flower. Then, we would see a girl with blonde hair cutting plants with scissors but would be interrupted by a woman calling her name, Rachel. This call would startle the little Rachel, causing her to fall, but she would be fine, which would relieve her mother, who would tell them to go inside the house as her uncle was about to arrive. After that, we would see a man with a hat and glasses arriving at the house where Rachel and her mother lived. Rachel would be excited to see this man and would ask him how he was doing. During dinner time, Rachel's mother would ask about his day, and the uncle would say that the castle's lord was always in a bad mood and that he had executed 5 people that week. But Rachel's mother would say not to talk about that in front of the child, so Rachel would ask her uncle about a white flower she found in the garden, and her uncle would tell her to ask her mother since she was the gardener. She would then ask how the flower looked, and Rachel would describe it with white petals and a stem with some thorns. Her mother would then say that it sounded like a rosselbeja, but Rachel would say no, that it was all white. Her mother would think that if it was a flower from the yard, she should know it, but then Rachel, using her power, would start forming that flower. Seeing that it was only a matter of time before the castle discovered that Rachel had a power, but the young Rachel, not understanding what was happening, would just say not to fight. Her mother would then start packing their things to leave that place with her daughter. Her uncle would say that she was crazy and that the residents of Grey Castle were forbidden from crossing the walls. But Rachel's mother would say that she didn't care, and if he wasn't going to help, then he should leave. Rachel's uncle resignedly gave her a location, and Rachel's mother would hug him happily, thanking him for the help. Some time later, at the place where they were supposed to meet the uncle, they would find the corpse of Rachel's uncle being devoured by crows. Then, as they turned around, they would see a knight in black armor who had suddenly appeared in front of them. The guards would rush to attack him, but he would easily eliminate them using black flames. It would then be revealed that it was Ingen, who, without saying a word, freed Rachel without asking her any questions and let her make a grave for her mother. Rachel would ask Ingen what he was doing there. He would say that he had tried to attack the hero clan twice and had failed, and now he was going for the 3rd time. Seeing the happiness on Ingen's face, Rachel would feel envy, wishing she had hopes and dreams like him. But then she would see the castle, realizing that all her combined emotions had become the source of her power, and thinking that now she had a dream to return and kill the man who had taken everything from her and put his head on top of the tower. Back in the present, Sharpshooter would congratulate Rachel for her resilience but tell her to stay still to kill her. Rachel would respond that she still couldn't die, Then, she would call out to John, who would send the hero she was fighting flying with a single blow, landing above Rachel. She would take advantage of that to trap him with her power, sending him to her garden, saying that since she was not in a good mood, this would end quickly. And that's how the first part of this manhwa ends. If you have reached this part of the video, let me tell you that you have been one of the few people to make it here. So comment the word hero in the comments. Remember to subscribe to not miss any videos. With that said, see you in the next video.